The Arctic winds howled through the endless white, carrying whispers of a land that had seen too much change, too much loss. The ice was not as thick as it once was, and the air carried a strange warmth, a warning that the world was shifting. And in the middle of this unforgiving landscape, a tiny figure struggled against the biting cold, a lone polar bear cub, barely clinging to life. Before diving into this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe to Wildlife Legends for more heart-touching wildlife stories. Share this video with your friends, it might just open their hearts to the incredible world of polar bears. Now, let's get into this unforgettable story. The cub had once known warmth, the warmth of a mother's embrace, the comfort of her thick fur, the steady rhythm of her breath. But that warmth was gone now. The only thing left was ice, wind, and hunger. Its tiny paws trembled as it stumbled forward, the frost biting into its skin. Its mother had disappeared days ago, whether lost to starvation, thin ice, or something worse, the cub would never know. All it knew was that she had gone, and she was not coming back. It was too young to hunt. Too small to fight. The only thing keeping it moving was instinct, an invisible pull toward survival. But even instinct was starting to fail. Each step was slower than the last, each breath shallower. The world around the cub blurred, snow, ice, sky, all blending together into a merciless void. It was collapsing, its tiny body sinking into the snow, when fate decided to intervene. Far in the distance, past the endless ice, a figure moved. Not a bear, not a predator, something else entirely. A human. James Walker had spent the last 5 years photographing the Arctic. He had seen the ice shrink, the wildlife struggle, the world change before his very eyes. But nothing prepared him for what he saw that day. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a lump of snow, a shadow. But then it moved. His breath caught. A cub. Alone. His mind raced. A cub this young, without a mother, had no chance. It wouldn't last the night. His instincts told him to turn away, to remind himself that this was nature, that he couldn't interfere. But some moments change you forever. James dropped his camera, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he moved toward the tiny creature. It didn't react. It didn't have the strength to. He knelt beside it, feeling the icy chill radiating from its fragile body. It was breathing, but barely. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent years documenting the harsh beauty of the Arctic, but this wasn't just another photograph. This was a life. And he had a choice to make. James knew the rules of the wild, the unspoken pact between man and nature that dictated observation without interference. Yet, as he looked into the cub's fading eyes, he realized that sometimes, rules are meant to be broken. The Arctic had its own law, brutal and unforgiving, but the choice before him was a matter of humanity. He unzipped his heavy parka, carefully wrapping the cub in its warmth. It was alarmingly light, its ribs pressing through thin fur. James carried it back to his makeshift camp, his heart pounding. Each step felt like a battle, against the elements, against himself, and against the consequences of his decision. Inside his tent, the cold wind was dulled, but the urgency remained sharp. He melted snow over a portable stove, watching the water bubble and steam as he rummaged through his supplies. There was no formula for saving a polar bear cub, no guidebook to consult. He soaked a cloth in the warm water, gently pressing it against the cub's muzzle, hoping it would drink. At first, there was no response, just the shallow rise and fall of its chest. But then, a flicker of life. The cub's tongue flicked out, lapping at the droplets. Encouraged, James continued, whispering soothing words as if the creature could understand his promise to protect it. The night descended quickly, wrapping the world in a blanket of darkness. Outside, the wind roared, and the temperature plummeted. Inside the tent, however, a fragile bond was forming. The cub, too weak to protest, nestled into the warmth of the sleeping bag James offered, its small body quivering less as the hours passed. James couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of doubts and fears. What would happen when the cub grew stronger? Where could it go in a world where its home was disappearing faster than it could grow? His thoughts drifted to the images he had captured, of glaciers crumbling into the sea, of polar bears stranded on isolated ice floes. He had always viewed his work as a way to show the world what was happening, but this cub made it personal. It was no longer just a story, it was a life caught in the balance of a changing planet. As dawn's first light seeped through the fabric of the tent, the cub stirred. Its eyes, now slightly brighter, met James's gaze. There was a silent exchange, one of trust, of understanding. The creature had no reason to trust humans, yet here it was, relying entirely on the kindness of one. James knew he couldn't keep the cub forever. The Arctic was no place for a man, let alone a young bear with no family. He needed a plan, a way to ensure the cub could survive in a world that seemed determined to erase it. He made radio contact with a nearby research station, his voice heavy with urgency as he described the situation. They offered assistance, but their hesitation was palpable. The logistics of rescuing a polar bear were complex, the odds of success uncertain. But James was resolute. He had taken responsibility for this life, and he wouldn't abandon it now. The cub was growing stronger with each passing hour, nibbling on small scraps of fish James had brought for his own meals. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rekindle a spark of life. As the days stretched on, James found himself speaking to the cub, sharing stories of a world it would never see, the bustling cities, the forests, the vastness beyond the ice. And in those moments, he realized that this cub was more than just an animal, it was a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the undeniable bond that could form between two beings from worlds apart. Yet, even in this growing bond, a shadow loomed, a reminder that every sunrise brought them closer to a decision that could alter both their lives forever. The Arctic sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the frozen landscape. The days were short, the nights endless, but inside James's small camp, time moved differently. Every moment was a battle against the inevitable, a fight to keep the cub alive long enough to find a solution. The cub, whom James had started calling Nanak, a traditional Inuit name for polar bears, had grown stronger. It was no longer just surviving, it was beginning to live. Its once hollow eyes now held a glimmer of curiosity, and its frail body had started to regain strength. It would nuzzle against James's arm, small paws batting playfully at his gloves, unaware of the impossible situation it was in. But James was painfully aware. The research station had responded again, this time with bad news. No official rescue could be arranged. Polar bear cubs without mothers were rarely reintroduced to the wild successfully. They needed their mothers to teach them how to hunt, how to survive. Without that knowledge, the odds were stacked against them. The best option, they told him, was a wildlife sanctuary far away, a place where Nanak could be safe, but never truly free. James clenched his fists as he listened to the static-filled transmission. A cage? A life behind glass walls? It felt like a betrayal, like stripping the Arctic from Nanak's soul. And yet, was it any better to leave the cub here, in a world that had already abandoned him? The dilemma clawed at James's mind, keeping him awake long after the fire had burned low. Nanak slept curled beside him, his soft fur rising and falling with steady breaths. James reached out, brushing his fingers gently over the cub's small head. "What do I do, little guy?" he murmured. "Where do you belong?" Nanak stirred but did not wake. The innocence in that tiny form, the trust it had placed in him, made the weight of the decision unbearable. The next morning, James packed up camp. He couldn't stay in this one spot forever. If he was going to find a way to save Nanak, he had to move. The nearest village was nearly 80 miles away, a dangerous journey across shifting ice and unpredictable weather. But James had no other choice. He secured Nanak in a modified sled, wrapping him in blankets and strapping down supplies. The cub let out a small noise of protest but quickly settled, his golden eyes watching James with unwavering trust. With one last look at the desolate tundra, James tightened his coat and started walking. The Arctic stretched endlessly ahead, an unforgiving expanse of white and blue. Ice cracked beneath James's boots, the wind howled like a living thing, but he pressed on, knowing that every step forward was a step toward hope. But hope was fragile in a place like this. And the Arctic had one final test in store. The Arctic was merciless. With each step, James felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against his body. The wind howled like a wild beast, tearing through his layers, biting at his skin. The sled behind him groaned as it slid over the uneven terrain, the ropes straining against the relentless gusts. Nanak remained bundled in the blankets, occasionally poking his head out, his dark eyes scanning the frozen world with an innocent curiosity that made James's heart ache. Every few hours, he stopped to check on the cub, offering him small pieces of fish and melting ice for water. Nanak was still weak, but his spirit was growing. He pawed at James's coat, playfully nipping at the fabric, unaware of the brutal reality they were facing. The journey was supposed to take 3 days, but James knew the Arctic had a way of rewriting even the best-laid plans. By the second night, the sky had turned angry. Dark clouds stretched across the horizon, swallowing the dim light of the sun. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that sent a shiver down James's spine. He had seen this before. A storm was coming. James quickened his pace, scanning the landscape for any form of shelter. The open ice was a death trap in a blizzard, visibility would drop to nothing, temperatures would plummet, and the wind would become an unrelenting force capable of burying them alive. He needed to find cover. Fast. Then, through the haze of snow, he saw it, a jagged ridge of ice rising in the distance. A glacier. Hope surged through him as he adjusted his course, pulling the sled behind him with renewed urgency. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he didn't stop. The first flakes of snow began to fall. Then the wind howled louder. Then the world vanished. The blizzard hit like a tidal wave, swallowing everything in an instant. James barely had time to react before the force of the wind knocked him to his knees. Snow whipped around him, blinding, suffocating. The sled jerked violently as the wind threatened to rip it away. He reached for the ropes, securing them with numb fingers. Nanak let out a small, frightened whimper, curling deeper into the blankets. James knew he couldn't let panic take over. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward, one agonizing step at a time. The glacier was close, he could feel it, even if he couldn't see it. The ground beneath him became uneven, shifting, treacherous. Ice cracked underfoot, the sound drowned by the roar of the storm. Then, suddenly, a shadow loomed ahead. A break in the ice. A crevice. James barely had time to react before the ground beneath him gave way. For a split second, he felt weightless. Then, pain. A sharp impact as his body slammed against something solid. The world tilted. His vision blurred. The roar of the storm became distant, muffled by the ice closing around him. He had fallen. He lay there for a moment, dazed, trying to catch his breath. Then, through the disorienting haze, a single thought screamed in his mind. Nanak. The sled. The cub. Where were they? Ignoring the pain shooting through his body, James forced himself up, his hands scraping against the rough ice. He was in some kind of glacial cave, the walls smooth and glowing with an eerie blue light. The storm raged above, but down here, there was only silence. And then, a small, terrified cry. James turned sharply. His heart nearly stopped. Nanak was there, dangling from the edge of the crevice. The sled had partially fallen in, one side caught on an outcrop of ice. The ropes strained, fraying under the weight. One wrong movement, and the cub would plunge into the darkness below. James didn't think. He moved. Ignoring the searing pain in his ribs, he crawled toward the edge, his hands gripping the ice with desperate strength. The ropes were slipping. The sled creaked. Nanak's small paws scrabbled against the ice, his eyes wide with terror. James reached out, his fingers grazing the cub's fur. So close. The ropes snapped. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to freeze. Then, in a burst of adrenaline, James lunged forward, his arms wrapping around Nanak just as the sled plunged into the abyss. The impact knocked the wind out of him. His grip tightened instinctively as the cub squirmed in fear. His body dangled over the edge, held up only by the sheer strength of his frozen fingers clawing at the ice. James gritted his teeth, muscles screaming. His breath came in sharp gasps as he fought to pull them both back up. One pull. Then another. The ice was slick, unrelenting. But James refused to let go. With one final, desperate heave, he threw his weight backward, dragging both himself and Nanak onto solid ground. They collapsed in a heap, panting, shivering. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Nanak, still trembling, crawled toward James, and pressed his small body against his chest. James closed his arms around him, holding the cub close. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but beneath it, he could hear Nanak's, a steady, fragile rhythm. They were alive. For now. But the Arctic wasn't finished with them yet. And neither was fate. James held Nanak close, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body ached from the fall, his fingers burned with cold, but none of it mattered. They were alive. The blue glow of the glacial cave flickered as the wind howled above them. James looked up, scanning the icy walls. The fall had been brutal, but by some miracle, he had landed on a ledge rather than plummeting into the abyss below. He could see the jagged edges where the ice had shattered beneath his weight, the remains of the sled nowhere in sight. Nanak whimpered softly, nuzzling into his chest. The cub was frightened, exhausted, and so was James. But there was no time to rest. They had to get out of here. James pushed himself onto his knees, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. He reached for his pack, gone. The sled had carried most of his supplies into the darkness below, leaving him with only what he had in his pockets. A lighter. A small knife. A handful of dried fish. It wasn't enough. He scanned the cave, searching for a way up. The walls were steep, slick with ice, but if he could find handholds, he might be able to climb. He had to. But just as he started to move, something shifted. A deep, low groan echoed through the cavern. James froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent enough time in the Arctic to recognize that sound. The ice was unstable. Another crack. Then another. The glacier was moving. James's mind raced. If they didn't get out now, they could be trapped, or worse, crushed beneath the shifting ice. He had to think fast. Nanak let out a soft whine, pressing closer to him. James placed a reassuring hand on the cub's back. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, more to convince himself than the bear. He spotted a narrow passageway to the right, a dark tunnel carved into the ice. It sloped upward, a possible way out. James didn't hesitate. He scooped Nanak into his arms and started moving. The tunnel was narrow, the walls pressing in on either side. Ice dripped from the ceiling, the air heavy with the scent of cold and time itself. James stumbled forward, his legs weak, his breath sharp in the freezing air. Then, a light. A faint glow filtered through the ice ahead, barely visible but unmistakable. An opening. A way out. James quickened his pace, ignoring the pain in his body. The ice beneath him creaked, threatening to give way. He could hear the glacier groaning, the pressure building, they were running out of time. With one final push, James burst through the opening. Blinding white light flooded his vision. The storm had passed. James collapsed onto the ice, gasping for air. Nanak tumbled beside him, shaking the snow from his fur. For a long moment, they just lay there, the sky stretching endlessly above them. They had escaped. But the journey wasn't over yet. James forced himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The storm had altered the landscape, erasing the familiar paths. The village was still miles away, and now, without his sled, the journey would be even harder. But as James looked down at Nanak, the cub staring up at him with unwavering trust, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't give up. No matter what it took, he would get Nanak to safety. Even if it cost him everything. James trudged forward, each step an act of sheer will. His body was battered, his fingers stiff with cold, but he refused to stop. Nanak followed closely, his tiny paws sinking into the snow with every step. The cub was tired, hungry, but alive. And James was determined to keep it that way. The storm had left the landscape unrecognizable. What was once a clear path to the village was now a treacherous, snow-covered wasteland. The ice beneath his feet groaned, shifting unpredictably. Every step was a gamble. James's breath came in ragged gasps. He had no supplies, no sled, and no clear sense of direction. But he had hope. Then, in the distance, movement. A dark silhouette against the endless white. James squinted, his heart pounding. A bear. But not just any bear. A mother bear. Nanak let out a soft whimper, his small body tensing. James tightened his grip on the cub. If this was his mother, there was a chance she would recognize him. But if she didn't, they were in danger. The mother bear lumbered closer, her massive paws crunching against the snow. Her eyes locked onto James, then onto Nanak. A long silence stretched between them. Then, a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl. Not a threat. Something else. A call. Nanak stiffened. Then, hesitantly, he took a step forward. James held his breath. The mother bear sniffed the air, taking another step toward them. Her dark eyes flickered with something, recognition. Then, in a moment so delicate it felt like time itself had paused, Nanak let out a tiny, trembling cry. The mother bear responded with a deep, mournful sound. And then, Nanak ran. The cub bolted toward the massive bear, his tiny legs kicking up the snow. The mother didn't move at first, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, as Nanak reached her, she bent down and sniffed him, her large body visibly trembling. James felt his chest tighten. This was his mother. Somehow, against all odds, she had survived. Nanak pressed against her, burying his small head into her fur. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling breath, one of relief, of exhaustion, of love. James swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He had done it. He had saved the cub. And now, he had to let him go. The realization hit him like a wave. After everything they had been through, after all the nights spent curled up together against the cold, after the bond they had forged, it was time to say goodbye. Nanak turned back to James, his dark eyes wide and filled with something he couldn't describe. James forced a smile. "Go on, buddy," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The cub hesitated. Then, slowly, he padded back to James and pressed his small head against his chest one last time. James ran a hand over the cub's soft fur, memorizing the feel of him. This moment. This impossible, beautiful moment. Then, with one final look, Nanak turned and followed his mother into the wild. James watched them disappear into the snow-covered horizon, his heart both heavy and full. Nanak was safe. And that was all that mattered. As James turned to begin his own journey back, he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget this. Because in saving Nanak, he had saved something in himself, too.